Russia's Kursk operation has become the most catastrophic self-inflicted military wound in modern Russian history. What began as a controlled counteroffensive to reclaim border territory transformed, over months of grinding attrition, into a bleeding wound that consumed divisions whole. The numbers are staggering, the strategic logic behind them even more damning. By April of 2025, Ukraine's General Staff had confirmed that Russian losses inside Kursk Oblast alone had surpassed 62. 400 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. When you fold in the North Korean contingent that Moscow was forced to deploy out of sheer desperation, the total human cost of reclaiming a single border region climbs towards 70,000. This is not a casualty figure associated with victory. This is the arithmetic of collapse. To understand how Russia arrived at this catastrophic outcome, you must first understand what Ukraine's August 2024 incursion actually represented. Ukrainian regular forces crossed into Kursk Oblast and seized approximately 1,300 square kilometers of Russian sovereign territory, the most significant cross-border assault since the initial Russian invasion 2 years prior. The speed and precision of that penetration created an immediate and existential political crisis for Vladimir Putin, whose entire domestic narrative rested on the premise that the war would never reach Russian soil. That narrative shattered in a single week. The Kremlin could not absorb the optics of Russian citizens fleeing Russian towns in a war Putin publicly refused to call a war. The political pressure to respond became overwhelming. That pressure produced a series of decisions that would prove catastrophically expensive. Russia's initial military response to the Ukrainian incursion was operationally incoherent. Rather than establishing a methodical, layered defensive perimeter and forcing Ukraine to extend its supply lines into an unfavorable engagement, Russian commanders threw available forces directly at Ukrainian positions in poorly coordinated frontal assaults. The convoy strike at Oktyabrskoye stands as one of the clearest illustrations of this doctrinal failure. Ukrainian HIMARS systems targeted a Russian military column moving through the Glushkovsky district along a predictable resupply corridor. 15 military trucks were destroyed in a single strike. Analyst group Nexta calculated that with each vehicle capable of carrying up to 35 fully equipped soldiers, the strike may have killed or wounded between 200 and 490 personnel in a single night. A Russian telegram channel acknowledged the losses bluntly, writing that 3 to 4 companies, effectively an entire battalion, had been destroyed. This was not an isolated incident. It was a template that repeated itself across dozens of similar engagements throughout the campaign. The decision to deploy North Korean troops to Kursk represents perhaps the most jarring admission of strategic failure in the entire war. Moscow committed approximately 12,000 North Korean soldiers to the region, an act that required extraordinary diplomatic maneuvering and revealed the depth of Russia's manpower crisis. Of those 12,000, an estimated 4,000 were killed. One of the 3 North Korean brigades was, by all accounts, effectively destroyed as a coherent fighting force. The other 2 lost meaningful combat capability. Russia had essentially borrowed a foreign army, fed it into a meat grinder, and returned what remained. The fact that this arrangement was considered preferable to alternatives available to Moscow is a concrete manifestation of how severely the Kremlin's recruitment infrastructure had been strained by 2 years of unsustainable attrition rates. The manpower mathematics underlying the Kursk campaign are particularly revealing. Throughout the first months of 2026, Russia's monthly battlefield casualties across all theaters ranged between 30,000 to 34,000 personnel. Its recruitment rate during the same period reached approximately 27,000 new soldiers per month. This means Russia was losing men faster than it could replace them, a deficit that, when sustained across multiple months, creates a compounding structural deterioration in combat effectiveness. New recruits entering the system lacked the training and battlefield experience of the professionals they were replacing. Junior officer casualties had been especially severe, stripping units of the institutional knowledge that sustains tactical coherence under fire. The brigades engaging Ukrainian positions in Kursk were not the same caliber of force that crossed into Persian game, the border, in February 2022. They were a patchwork. By March of 2025, Russian forces had pushed Ukrainian troops out of the bulk of the territory initially captured, reclaiming approximately 64% of the ground that had been seized. The Kremlin presented this as vindication. Putin's information apparatus declared the incursion defeated and the border restored. But this framing deliberately obscures the actual strategic equation. Russia expended somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 total casualties, including killed, wounded, missing, destroyed North Korean allied forces to recover territory that Ukraine had seized with a fraction of those losses. The cost-to-outcome ratio is not the ratio of a military that won. It is the ratio of a military that simply outweighed its opponent in disposable human capital and ground them down through attrition until the position became logistically untenable for the lighter force. Furthermore, the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Kursk did not represent the clean Russian victory that state media portrayed. As late as October 2025, Ukrainian spokespeople confirmed that some Ukrainian units continued to hold positions inside Russian territory. The complete liberation that the Kremlin repeatedly announced remained incomplete on the ground. Ukrainian forces had transformed the incursion from a territorial hold into a prolonged attritional trap. Russia to concentrate combat power, logistics, air defense assets onto a secondary theater while the main front in eastern Ukraine continued to demand resources simultaneously. The strategic burden was the point. How Russia's air defense and artillery systems performed inside Kursk also illuminates broader systemic failures. Russian commanders repeatedly concentrated troop formations along predictable resupply routes, apparently failing to internalize the lessons about dispersion that Ukrainian drone and precision strike campaigns had been teaching since 2022. The HIMARS convoy strike at Oktyabrskoye was devastating precisely because Russian units were massed and moving in column formation without adequate reconnaissance or air cover. These are not the operational habits of a military successfully adapting to modern warfare. They are the habits of an institution so depleted in experienced leadership that it defaults to Soviet-era movement protocols in environments where those protocols are lethal. The broader casualty trajectory of the entire war reinforces this picture. Russian forces had suffered an estimated 1.4 million total battlefield casualties between February 2022 and June 2026, including between 400,000 and 450,000 killed in action. These are figures without modern precedent. No major power since World War II has absorbed losses of this scale in any conflict. The loss of professional soldiers experienced NCOs. Junior officers prove disproportionately damaging because these are the personnel who translate tactical doctrine into functional battlefield execution. Their replacements, drawn increasingly from contract recruits with compressed training timelines, cannot perform the same functions at the same level. The qualitative degradation of Russian forces is not visible, order of battle charts. But it becomes apparent in the tactical decisions that produce convoy massacres and battalion-scale losses in a single engagement. The rate of territorial advance that Russia managed to sustain through this period tells a similarly grim story. Across the first 4 months of 2026, Russian forces averaged just 2.9 square kilometers of daily gain across all theaters, down from 9.76 square kilometers per day during the same period a year earlier. In their most active offensive sectors, advances were measured in meters per day. The slowest major offensive campaigns of the 20th century moved faster. Russia was spending tens of thousands of men per month to advance at a pace that would take years to meaningfully alter the front line's position. And inside Kursk, where the operational objective was not advance, but recovery. Even this comparison understates the inefficiency of what was happening. Putin's decision to scale back the annual Victory Day military parade in May 2026 captured something essential about this moment. The parade, a ritual of state power and military projection that the Kremlin treats as sacred, was curtailed because of concerns about Ukrainian long-range strike capability. The most visible symbol of Russian military prestige had become a security liability. The implicit acknowledgement embedded in that decision that Ukrainian forces could threaten targets deep inside Russia with sufficient confidence to force changes in the Kremlin's own ceremonial calendar, represents the kind of psychological concession that the official Russian narrative cannot afford to examine directly. The North Korean deployment, the convoy massacres, the battalion-scale losses in single engagements, the monthly casualty deficits that exceed recruitment capacity. Each element of the Kursk campaign represents a facet of the same underlying condition. Russia entered the Kursk crisis with the doctrinal assumption that overwhelming mass could substitute for tactical sophistication. It paid the price that assumption has consistently demanded throughout this war. The 62,400 casualties confirmed by Ukraine's General Staff by late April 2025, climbing toward the 70,000 threshold when Allied losses are incorporated, are the concrete mathematical expression of what it costs to reclaim territory through attrition when the adversary has internalized precision strike doctrine and you have not. The Russian soldiers who died in those fields and along those road corridors were not sacrificed in service of a strategy capable of ending this war on favorable terms. They were consumed by a command structure that had run out of better options and substituted bodies for ideas.